To this webinar talk. So this paper is an initial reaction that we had to the corona crisis. My colleagues are Marwan Izzeldin from University of Lancaster, Vasileios Pappas from University of Kent, and Sheeja Sivaprasad from University of Westminster are all on the webinar today. So what I will do is I will do the presentation and then answer only the simple, easy questions, and I will leave the difficult ones to my colleagues that will be with us at the Q&A as well. So we started with some technical difficulties, but we have so far overcome them. Also, if something happens, don't worry, Alicia is on it and all the co-authors are there, so we're not going to cut it in the middle. Okay, so we started with discussing the complexity of the COVID as an event. It's an external shock to the system, and it can be studied in various different ways, and it has various different aspects. So the aspect that we're looking at is the markets absorbing the information, and we observe that through the reaction of the markets, and we observe that through the volatility that changes. So when you look at this graph, I'm going to show you again the same graph. You can see that at various events, from the global financial crisis to the European sovereign debt crisis, the markets react to the information, and one way of measuring a crisis episode is through measuring the volatility and the reaction through volatility, measuring the reaction of the markets through the volatility generated by this external shock. So when you look at the sentiment indicators, the sentiment is down, and the sentiment is down in various different measurements comparable to the 2008 crisis, and employment indicators also indicate high levels of unemployment. So with various indicators, we can see that with the corona shock, we entered a crisis episode. So we also discussed among ourselves the expected contractions in the economy. The global contraction expected is somewhere between 3 to 6%, which is very high, and compared to the 2008 crisis, which is higher than the contraction during the world contraction during the 2008 crisis. So there is a literature, but in fact, a very thin literature, that the financial markets are affected from the epidemics and other outside shocks. I mean, shocks outside the financial system, the economic system, including natural disasters such as earthquake, including terrorist attacks, plane crashes, etc. So in this episode, the corona crisis, what we wonder is, are the shocks to the sectors comparable across the different countries? And are the shocks to the sectors different from previous crises? So, for example, when you look at the 2008 crisis, it mainly started with the crisis in the financial sector. When you look at the 1929 Great Depression, again, it started within the financial sector, but this time the shock is external, and it's coming through a virus. So this is an early attempt, and we're starting, we're analyzing the entry of COVID into our lives. And we look at the G7 markets, which are the largest financial markets in the world. So And we're studying the transition process from a tranquil environment to a crisis environment. We focus on 10 business sectors, and we model a volatility shift from a calm to a crisis. So we're using, I'll give you some more details about the methodology that we use, which is smooth transition heterogeneous autoregressive model that enables us to measure the intensity, timeliness, and homogeneity of the crisis across the sectors and across these G7 countries. We use daily data. And the G7 countries, just as a reminder, are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, and US. We use the value-weighted indices from these countries in calculating the returns in a continuously compounded way. And we use the 10 sectors: consumer goods, consumer services, financials, healthcare, industrials, materials, oil and gas, technology, communications, and utilities. And the data for COVID-19 identified cases is from the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Research Center, and it is given at the daily level for each country, and it's available from the 1st of January in 2020. But obviously there are very few cases in January, and we start the analysis from the beginning of February. So this is a picture of the annualized volatility in these G7 countries. And it's very obvious that as of March, there is a jump in volatilities in every country. So some more, some less, but it's very clear that we observe a jump in volatility. Now, a bit of information about the model. We start with the heterogeneous autoregressive model. And as you can see on the monthly plots, that there is a hyperbolic decay pattern, and the methodology enables us to capture that. We use the ST version of the ST-HAR model, and it allows for a smooth transition between two regimes. And you can see that the transition function is an exponential function that allows the transition to be smooth. In terms of findings, the first set of findings I will be reporting will be on the transition between the regimes. And we look at the slope and the threshold coefficients for that. And it's very clear that there is a nonlinear smooth transition between the calm and the crisis regimes for all sectors and all economies that they're looking into. So the two regime parameters are statistically significant in all cases. And they show that there are changes on the level and the first lag autocorrelation dynamics of the volatility function. So the parameters measuring the dependence of the current volatility on the factors that we use are important for a number of subsets of the sectors that we analyze. So this is the results table. The next set of findings are about the intensity and the timeliness of the corona crisis. So when we look at the intensity of the transition to a new regime, we see that the intensity is highest in the healthcare sector, and it's followed by the utilities and the consumer services. And when we look at the uniformity of intensity, it's least uniform in healthcare and most uniform in consumer goods. The US and UK are the most severely hit by the corona crisis. They have the highest heterogeneity in their response, and this could be interpreted as a reflection of the indecisiveness of the political response to the pandemic crisis. So you remember that at the beginning of the crisis, both in the US and in the UK, there was a lot of discussion as to whether to leave it to a herd community, a herd immunity, whether to leave the solution to a herd immunity or to introduce the lockdowns, the nature of the lockdowns, the timing of the lockdowns. In the US, different states had different attitudes. So it was a lot of ambiguity at the time. So in terms of the timeliness of the transition to the crisis regime, oil and gas and communications are the first to be affected, and US is the first that's affected by the crisis. I mean, it's a big economy, and there was a lot of uncertainty at the beginning. So it's kind of like expected that they're the earliest that's affected. So this is the table where we present the slope and the threshold by sectors and by countries. And this is a picture of the threshold weights for some sectors, not all of them, but some of them here. Next, we include policy response to the crisis into our analysis, and we look into the government response index and the containment and health index in measuring the government response. So systematically in all the countries that we look into, there was government reaction this way or the other. And we start the analysis from the 1st of February on that one as well. So we observe a negative relationship between policy response indices and the intensity of the crisis. So, and that depends on how thoroughly and how these countries reacted to the crisis. So that's our table for the crisis intensity policy response. And that's again a picture of the intensity of the crisis and the response of the several governments in one of the indices that we have for health and a general picture. And you can see it's very clear that as the intensity in the government response index increases, then the intensity of the crisis becomes a bit smaller. For comparison, we look at other major events over the last century. So we look into the S&P 500 from 1927 onwards to include the Great Depression of 1929. And we look into conditional volatility estimated from a GART-11 model. In addition, we use the CBOE volatility index based on options. And we use economic policy uncertainty, another new news-based indicator of economic uncertainty. And among the previous events, the response to COVID is still the most significant. So when you look at this graph, whatever the volatility measure we use is, whether it's realized or it's estimated or whichever way it's estimated, then when you compare the corona crisis, the volatility jump is very significant. So it's comparable to bigger than the Great Depression, the World War II recession, the oil crisis, the Gulf War, the the crash of the dot-com bubble, the SARS epidemic, the Euro crisis, etc. So it is, it's big compared to previous events over a century. We have conducted a number of robustness tests to replace the GARCH11 estimations with realized measures. And we use the realized variance and a realized kernel variance with an adjustment. And the results are robust to the definition of the volatility that we employ. We have another set of robustness tests, and we use a time-varying parameter explicitly. And the coefficients are highly variable, and the goodness of fit deteriorates. I mean, we can observe that the linear models can hardly capture the volatility transition effect, but still the results are very similar to our estimations using the ST-HAR model. The heterogeneity in the countries and the sectors' response are very similar when we use a model that explicitly accounts for a time-varying parameter. So here are some pictures about these models. So to conclude, I will say that this is an initial attempt to understand the COVID-19 episode as a crisis. And one way to understand the crisis is through the volatility shift and through how the markets react to the COVID-19 event. So we try to see this by looking if there is a regime shift. So do we move from a tranquil regime to a crisis regime? And for that, we use a smooth transition heterogeneous autoregressive model. So that enables us to quantify the transition. So we'll look into the intensity, timeliness, and homogeneity of the volatility shift. We look into the largest 7 economies in the world and different sectors in these economies. We use various alternative measures for volatility, and the results are robust to all the measures that we use. And we show that there is a nonlinear transition to a crisis regime. And we move to a crisis regime in all the largest economies of the world, so it's worldwide, and we move into a crisis regime in all the sectors that we look at. So this is pretty much a worldwide crisis. The particular results, for example, the healthcare and the consumer services sectors being mostly severely affected, it says something to us about the pressures maybe on these sectors to develop a vaccine, which is still in process. Maybe we're near it, but it's still in process. But it's very clear from the beginning that these sectors would be impacted. And in the consumer services sectors, again, we all changed our daily lives. We even changed our work lives. And we're almost online throughout the day for entertainment, for work, etc. In terms of the largest economies, the largest of those basically, US and the UK, are the ones that took the largest hit. And that took also the first hit as well. So, I mean, there is heterogeneity across the business sectors, obviously, because of the operations of these sectors and because of the impact of the crisis on the different sectors. But the shock on the countries indicates to us that the initial policy response is important, and the ambiguity in the response creates additional uncertainty. And that additional uncertainty or the indecisiveness in policy response escalates the reactions from the markets. I mean, we know that we answer a question, but we don't answer every possible question that can be asked. So, I mean, as the crisis develops and as the country responses develop, then we will have to see the impact of other policy response, such as the furlough schemes, you know, whether they help the transition or whether they delay the transition. We don't know what will happen once that policy response is complete. So once the government stops the furlough schemes, we don't know how the markets will react to that. So again, we don't know, but that would be next year, maybe the year after, that we can see if we end up having quite a number of zombie companies, if that can be eliminated or not, and if the markets will have to live for an extended period with companies that go bankrupt under normal regimes, but they survive during a crisis regime. Obviously, there are issues that will be investigated by other disciplines, by other colleagues as well. One important issue is the employees and employers. Another one is the long-term capital investments and whether the crisis had an impact on is there another transition from one regime to another in the capital investments, in international capital investments, in capital expenditures of the existing companies, etc. So this is where I will stop the presentation. And now we're ready to take questions from you. I'm sorry that we have to take the questions at the end, but most of it is due to technical issues that this is the way we have to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gulnur. So if anybody has any questions, please add them to the Q&A or raise your hand so I can unmute. Thank you. Lovely, so you have a raised hand. So Richard, I'm allowed to talk now.
Oh, hi, Gulnur.
Hi, Richard.
That was really interesting. I joined about 5 minutes into it, so I was tied up on something else, but that's really interesting. Have you thought about looking at things like, I can't use on talk, just putting me off, but have you thought about things like indices, like sentiment for consumers and for investors, and relating it to volatility?
Sorry, Richard, can you repeat the question? I couldn't quite understand it.
Okay.
Alicia, can we see Richard as well while he's asking?
Yes, I can make Richard a presenter. If you give me a second. Gulnur, if you mute your mic in the meantime. Richard, if you give me a second, please.
Okay.
He'll be joining shortly. He'll be a panelist shortly. There's just a bit of a delay.
Okay. Oh, now I can see my mute and start video. I couldn't see that before. Okay. Hi, Gulnur. Hi, Vas as well. Hi there. Hi. Did you think about perhaps looking at something like indices for consumer sentiment, investor sentiment, those sort of measures, and then relating them to how the volatility has spiked during the crisis? So you're actually looking at how consumers and investors reacted in terms of sentiment.
No, not particularly, but that's a very good idea. Yeah, that's a very good idea. I mean, it could be even a two-stage moral, isn't it? I mean, the death rates increase, I mean, change the sentiment, and the sentiment has the impact, or it could be vice versa. No, we didn't. I mean, Vasileios, do you want to add something? I mean, are Sheeja and Marwan there?
Right, so I don't see Marwan. If you give me a second. Sheeja's here, and I'm promoting Sheeja to a panelist.
Yeah, Vasileios, do you want to add to it?
Yeah, I think Richard mentioned about consumers and investors, different responses, something like that. Did I get it correctly?
Well, the first round, I didn't get anything because the voice was, you know, not really good enough. I mean, Richard, did you
what I was saying,
distinguish consumers and investors?
Yeah, so what I was thinking was you've shown some lovely graphs on the volatility, the actual, if you're in a way, kind of the outcome of people's behavior.
Yeah.
But if we looked at something like the consumer sentiment or investor sentiment, or even managerial sentiment indices, we then get their kind of feelings as a behavioral input. That's all I was thinking is a possibility.
Yeah, it is a possibility, and I think it's a very good idea. No, we haven't looked at the consumer sentiment indices or the managerial.
Yeah, the idea here would be if you can get insights from a consumer index that is at such a high frequency, like at least daily is not particularly high frequency data, but the thing is that the stock markets would be more responsive to what is going on, I guess. So they would be the first ones to be affected. But the consumers across countries, for example, as the lockdowns were imposed, sitting on how their behavior has been affected, perhaps using some kind of indicator, maybe from online or big data or anything. Maybe.
I was thinking,
it's interesting.
There's a paper by Nofsinger from quite a few years ago, but he looks at how social mood can permeate across markets, and he has theory, etc., from consumers through companies through to investors, and then how it impacts on the stock market. So that might be a good kind of reference point as well to think about.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Richard.
I mean, that's valuable to us because I mean it's kind of like it could be measured. The reaction could be due to the mood, and it could be measured through the mood, you know, rather than the corona event itself.
Yeah.
So the mood that it shifted, or maybe there is a shift in the mood as well, and you know we can look at the transition from one mood to the other.
Yeah.
So maybe there is a shift from again a kind of like a indifferent mood to a fear mood. We don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay, very interesting.
Thank you.
Please keep your questions coming. If you've got any questions or comments, please add them to the Q&A or raise your hand and I can permit you to ask your questions.
I think there is a question from Ishani.
It was just regarding the audio, which we've now fixed. Apologies for that.
Okay, that's all right. Okay, do we have any other questions or comments?
Oh, one from Sushanta. If you give me a moment, Sushanta. Sushanta should be joining us as a panelist to ask his question shortly. There may be a delay on his side. So Sushanta, please unmute your mic and turn on your camera. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you, Sushanta.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I kind of missed the first part of your presentation, but anyway, I got the idea that there is a kind of a move towards a crisis regime, right? That's what you find. So, see, the problem is there is this uncertainty, right? In this uncertainty is not going to go away until there is, some kind of health solution like vaccine and all that. So therefore, this uncertainty is going to create economic uncertainty, market volatility, all these things will be there. So it is quite obvious to think that we are in a uncertain regime, right? In a regime where basically nobody has a way out. Even governments are keeping on spending money. That's the only thing they can do, right?
Yeah.
But nothing more can be done. And so as long as that uncertainty is there, this market volatility will continue because people do not know what to do, whether to spend today or postpone it or do it next year. Even next year, we will not have a solution. It will go on like that, right? So therefore, it is easy to understand that market is reflecting that sentiment, which we all have as consumers, which you are very clearly seeing in when you do this analysis across industries. And so I think maybe some kind of, I'm just thinking, of course, we know that the result is quite obvious, but I think to think in terms of some sectors getting affected more, some sectors probably they are fine, is that something you could exploit from the data? So that's how I think you may come out with some kind of interesting finding. But otherwise, the volatility, etc., will be there. I don't know whether you can make a point on that, right?
Yeah, I mean, actually, we received that comment before from a referee, and in the write-up of the paper, we had to address that. I think we can look at it in two ways. One is it's obvious that when there is uncertainty, well, the measurement of the uncertainty is the volatility. It's the most straightforward measure of the uncertainty, the risks imposed into the system. So this, I think, one contribution is that we're measuring the magnitude of it, and we're showing that the magnitude of it is comparable to 1929, it's comparable to 2008, it's comparable to more or less, and every crisis that we had over the past century. And whatever your measurement is for volatility, it's either higher or comparable, about the same level with the major previous events. So I think at one point, it's important to show that the magnitude is really high. So, it's a very general it's a very general finding, but I think it shows in itself the severity of the crisis. You are right in the second, maybe my presentation was very thin on it, but I think the next one is about the attributes of this volatility that we observe in different countries and in different sectors. So, for example, when you identify healthcare and consumer services, again, it may not be surprising, but at least what we're trying to do is to communicate that the crisis is coming from a virus. So it's completely external to the economic and financial system. And the first response is through the healthcare, and the most severe response is through the healthcare, where the uncertainty is much more. At the beginning, remember, the slogan was protect the NHS. So, we didn't know whether we could protect the NHS or not at that stage, and consumer services. And we didn't know really the extent of how much we would be using internet-based entertainment, internet-based shopping, internet-based working, etc. So that again, I mean, it may not be a shock, but again, we measure the magnitude of it. And again, in terms of the countries, the US takes the first hit, but obviously it's the largest economy in the world. And you know, it's very clear that they took the first hit, but also when you look at the initial policy response, the US had more ambiguity than, say, compared to Sweden. UK had a lot of ambiguity as well in the initial response, and that also is reflected in terms of the timing of the shock. So if there is uncertainty, obviously volatility measures that there is uncertainty, and the uncertainty is reflected there. So, I mean, we do have the estimations on sector basis and country basis. Maybe there was something missing in my presentation, and it wasn't quite clear that there were observed differences in the intensity of the crisis, in the timing of the crisis, etc. But we do have results on that.
Yeah, have you used the COVID data for each of these countries?
Yes.
You used that.
Yes, yes, we use the actual COVID data. So what Richard says is something else. It's about the sentiment.
Yeah.
So we use the raw COVID data, but we do not look at the relation between the public sentiment and the COVID data, and then the impact through the mood or the impact through the sentiment. It's the raw COVID data that we use. And I think, I mean, kind of like the, I mean, it's very raw and it's very direct, but eventually it's the reaction to that data, which was presented on a daily basis, and which was in almost every country in the world, really. It was presented on a daily basis, and it was presented as, you know, 1 to 20, 200, etc. And in a very similar manner.
Okay, very good, thank you.
It was public information, so that data was not private information, so it's not like M1, M2, any money supply figure that, you know, only the people who look, you know, who are interested follow that, but it was all over the newspapers, and it's pretty much in every country, it's public information. I think it's a very good point that, I mean, I think we have to include that in the write-up. We could do that, or we could do, I mean, there could be further analysis for sure.
Yeah, no, very good, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sushanta. If anyone's got any more questions, please put them in the Q&A or raise your hand so I can unmute you. Just to make everyone aware, we do have a seminar next week. I've put the information in the chat. It'd be great to see you all. We really appreciate you attending.
Yeah, let me add this as well. I think, I mean, there are some colleagues who don't use quantitative techniques, and this is a volatility estimation. So, I mean, you don't have to focus on the technique. You can give us your input, and you can discuss with us the results or the approach, just ignoring the technique. I mean, I know that it can be very mathematical to go over that, but feel free to give other comments.
Well, no, just to add, if I may.
Yes, of course.
So just to add to the point earlier that we were talking with Sushanta, but for the whole attendees as well. One of the sectors that we find that was the most affected, besides the healthcare, which is kind of obvious given the pandemic nature, it was the consumer services, which was the first sector that was into very big discussions about bailouts for the big airlines, Lufthansa, British Airways, Scandinavian, and all of these. And also most recently in the UK with the collapse of Debenhams and the Arcadia Group as a result of the COVID. So it is kind of evident that there is like a transition in the regime of volatility, but how much? So how do we quantify this, and how we make comparisons across countries and across sectors? That's where the novelty of our model lies, that it actually captures that, and we can draw comparisons on this. Because obviously, I mean, now we know in the second lockdown, we know a lot of more indicators, and we can have COVID-19 cases perhaps for regions and all of this. But back in March, when the stock markets reacted, it was more like a case that we don't know what's coming, and we don't know whether it's an epidemic or whether it's a pandemic, and what exactly is a pandemic. So what our figure, the big figure with the S&P volatility from the 1920s shows is that this is a pandemic, but the impact on the financial markets was more or less comparable to the biggest crisis that we have seen, including the Lehman, including the Black Monday events, and all of this. The stark difference is that the volatility has also dropped. So it was more like a big spike and not so much a pronounced period of heightened volatility, which I believe is attributed to the very big funding packages. So the US has committed more than $3 trillion in the first wave of the pandemic. The UK something similar, and the ECB as well. So the response was like 2 times what was the response in the global financial crisis. And one of the big, very novel indicators from Oxford University that tracks all these lockdown measures that we are also reporting is actually inversely related to the intensity. So it actually pays to be taking measures in terms of satisfying the markets in some way. And I believe that because of all these measures, it's why we haven't seen any other big spike in the financial markets since March.
Thank you very much, Vasileios. I'm putting on screen the slide on volatility. And again, you can see the peak here very clearly during COVID-19. And it's about in the 80s. Very clear.
Gulnur, we have another question from Richard. Okay. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Hi. Just a good point on, or just a point on this. So I went to a practitioner presentation where he looks very much similar kind of things at volatility. He's looking at COVID. One point he was making was that this is such a intense period, this 9-month period where we've had this kind of crisis, whereas other crises sometimes take a lot longer to manifest, but this has been such a short, sharp thing. He's very interested in volatility, but he also was showing a graph of returns of level, stock market level. And he was showing that, in March you had this crash, but he's showing that because of the quantitative easing and all the money pumping in, it's now zooming right up. The market has recovered and is at a very high level. So if you compare the volatility with the returns, we're saying that even though, or the levels of the stock market, even though the stock market is really at a high level, the volatility is still really high, isn't it? So would it be useful also to look at the returns over the...
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, obviously we calculate some of the volatility metrics from the returns, squaring them and adjusting the squared version, etc. So they are related. I mean, when you calculate any sort of standard deviation, it's related to returns as well. Yeah. But it's very clear that there is an increase in the stock market. We didn't study that, and we didn't study the sectoral composition of the index, how the index has increased. I think I think that's a very interesting question. And I think, you know, we might have a shift in volatility and a different type of behavior in the returns. The picking up the return reversal to me and the quick reversal of returns probably is about the market expectations, at least expectations about the certain sectors in the economy. We didn't look at that at all.
This practitioner's point, and he's very much into behavioral finance, etc., is that he thinks the kind of expectation thing is broken down because of the massive pumping in of money into the economy, which is inflating. So he said we're in a massive bubble now, actually, where he believes we're way above fundamentals.
It's possible that we're in a massive bubble. I think there are two more interesting sides of this crisis. So one is the injection of huge amounts of money, and we don't see a shift in demand, which is comparable to the cash injections. So in different forms, the cash injections are made, but basically people are sitting on the money. And anecdotal evidence was, for example, that people who apply for furloughs or who apply for unemployment during this period, they have to wait for a month or two, but they can borrow during that period easily, but they don't, and they queue in the food banks. So that, I think, it's anecdotal evidence, and we don't obviously observe that in macro data, but I think that's a very good indication how uncertain people are, and the cash injections are not effective in going through the economic activity. But there could be a side of the, which is about the kind of like the pass-through of the cash injections into the economy. And I think we'll be able to analyze that at least within a year. The second part is about at the company side and the corporate side. Again, the companies are still there, most of them. And when the furlough schemes end and when they're on their own, then there will be a shift of risk to the banking industry. We don't know, the speed of that shift. We don't know the intensity of the pressures that these companies will put on the banking system. We don't know how effectively or how quickly the banking system will absorb that risk. I mean, we will be studying some of those in the future. I also think, what Vasileios has mentioned in terms of Debenhams, in terms of Edinburgh Mills, for example, despite the furlough schemes, there are companies that went bust. And these companies, both of them, went bust because of the pressure from their suppliers, which has something to do with the way they operate, their operations. So these are retail firms, and the operation is usually you purchase the goods and you keep an accounts payable and you pay your suppliers through the cash incoming from your sales, isn't it? So that link is broken and there is no protection to that link. There is a protection on spending on labors, there is protection on rent, but there is no protection on accounts payable. And these suppliers, they could be international, they could be national, but these suppliers, again, the same situation for these suppliers. The suppliers to Debenhams or the suppliers to Edinburgh Mill, they do have their own suppliers as well. They have to buy the raw cotton or the raw wool to do the production. So there is a kind of like a chain effect as well. And there is no way that, I don't think that we can measure it now. I think it will take a while for us to be able to measure. And again, as Vasileios mentioned, in this case, we're looking at the early reactions and we're using very frequent, high frequency, well, not high frequency, but the frequency is high at the daily level. But some of the other issues we can only measure either at the monthly level and some of them even at the annual level. So, I mean, the balance sheet information, we can't measure that before a year. And most of the other information, including the various indices, we can't measure them. We can measure them on a monthly level. So I think the issue that your practitioner colleague is raising is a very valid issue. It is a valid issue. And that the stock markets, I mean, not only in the UK, but also in the US and worldwide, the indices are increasing and they're almost there to their pre-crisis period. Whereas we can measure the shift in the mood, the shift in expectations, the shift into a crisis episode.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good question. I mean, Vasileios, do you want to add something?
Oh, just to add that, for some reason, if you consider all this that is happening, I mean of COVID cases, the deaths, and all of these, and if you consider the reaction of the stock markets, to me personally, it seems that something is out of line. I mean, I would expect some higher volatility in this, like in the autumn of 2020. The reason that perhaps we do not observe this is that all in this together, and as perhaps the vaccine gets promoted, general population, perhaps at different timings between the US, the UK, and Europe, we might start to see differences in countries of how countries exit from this crisis. And of course, furlough schemes exist in most of them. There should be differences, of course, among them, but they typically protect like a pay. I mean, so obviously it's not that they cover everything, every kind of salary that you may have. Of course, there is heterogeneity across countries on this, so you cannot go on forever using this injection, this liquidity injection. I mean.
Thank you both. We had some questions that have been answered kindly by our panelists, by both Ishani and Sukriya. I hope I said that right. We have Praveen Gupta has a question, so I shall be promoting you to a panelist so you can talk, Praveen. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Oh, okay. Shall I on my? Yeah.
Yes,
I haven't shaved in 2 days, so that's why I was not moving oning my video camera. Okay. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting presentation and discussion after that. My network connection was a bit patchy, so I missed a bit of it. So, apologies in advance in case the question which I'm asking you have already addressed it. In that case, just say that you have addressed it. When you actually talk about volatility, obviously, most of the time the academics focus on the historical volatility or the realized volatility. Have you sort of considered the implied volatility, which is sort of implied in the options market, whereby what is the actually forward-looking volatility, what the market expects to happen in the next 3 to 6 months rather than just focusing on the past?
Yes, we did. I mean, we use an options index.
Okay.
And it's in our robustness test. We did the results are robust. We used about how many, Vasileios? In total, 5 different measures for volatility, I think. And one of them is option-based, yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yes, one is option-based. We also use the realized volatility, the realized kernel. And of course, the main story is built on the on GARCH 1.1 volatility because we have data for the sectors as well.
Okay, thank you.
So
thank you
we
very
kept
much.
the others as robust.
Thank you, Pradeep.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions before we come to a close, anyone? if you'd like to raise your hand or add them to the Q&A so we can ask, so we can answer them for you. Thank you. I believe that is it, Gulnur. Did you want to close?
Yeah, I would like to, thank you. I would like to thank everyone for attending and for their valuable comments. I think we benefited a lot from the comments. I think they were excellent comments, and we really benefited a lot. And oh, Ishani says something. I miss everything Ishani says. So, Ishani, if you have a question, we'll take the question and then close.
Ishani, oh, lovely. I'll just promote Ishani to a panelist. You give me a second, Ishani. Thank you. Please unmute your mic and your video. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Gulnur. Probably that's the most popular word, you know, the word or the sentence I asked this year. Can you hear me? Have you muted me? Thank you for the presentation. I think you've answered my question, Gulnur. I was also thinking, you know, during the semester that in the teaching that because accounting financial figures are yet to come, right? Yeah. So we quite, you know, not yet know that in the quarterly and half yearly reports aren't quite industry by industry. And then you took the example Debenhams, and I'm also thinking about, you know, Sir Philip Green's. It's not really a reaction to, you know, the pandemic. It was, you know, he was always playing the cards around this, right? So that's that, you know, such kind of industries and also the market, you know, it can give a real shock to the market because of the, you know, how it's going to impact so many, you know, Topshop has been, you know, on the cards for a long time, wasn't it? That, you know, so many, you know, people are going to lose jobs, etc. So yeah, you answered that question already, say, you know, maybe. And my other question was, Gulnur, to think that, you know, as a market, it's kind of, you know, this market as, you know, so many different and industrial sector by sector. And do you have you got plans to look at also kind of a more kind of from a more meta as well as more from a kind of, you know, from a more industry level data to look at? Because some of the industries obviously must have done well in this pandemic, right? I was thinking more about, you know, some of the pharmaceuticals, definitely. So their contribution, vice versa, the ones that, you know, have not done good. For example, I was thinking at the time when we couldn't find the hand sanitizers, you know, some of the pharmaceuticals and some of these companies must have made a real contribution, right, to this pandemic, and, you know, the face mask, etc., etc. So will you have a industry analysis for that to kind of pitch that industry?
Yeah, I mean, the industry analysis we have includes 10 broadly defined industries, basically. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there could be various other definitions of the industries. It could be very narrow definitions of the industries. And I think, I mean, most of it in terms of, I mean, at this point, the basic analysis we can do, I mean, we're doing it's not high frequency data, it's not intraday data, but it's daily data. Mm-hmm. And none of these performance measures are available on a daily basis. So to be able to observe the first quarter is now released, mm-hmm. but the first quarter is ending end of March.
Yes.
So you have January, February in it. So I think I think there will be different types of analysis mm-hmm. Once we have more balance sheet data.
Yes.
So in terms of firm performance, the only performance we can observe at the moment is the price performance. Obviously, it includes the expectations of the market about the future operations of these companies. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we can see that through that. But we didn't look in this paper. I think I made a note of it, and obviously we'll discuss this after this presentation with the co-authors. I made a note of it, that it's one performance we can measure is through the returns. And basically what you're saying is look at the performance as well. I think, yes, we should look at the performance, and Richard has elaborated that in a slightly different way from you, that when we look at the returns, we're expecting the returns are increasing while the volatility shows that we're still in a crisis situation. So there is a discrepancy, very clear, that needs to be analyzed there. Yeah.
I'm also thinking things like airline industry. For example, I was looking at the other day the British Airlines data, Gulnur, that, you know, how they will also address this in the annual reports would be interesting. Yeah. And the overall annual performance would be interesting to see, right?
Yeah.
Because although they are, you know, they probably have the overheads quite similar because of, you know, the parking, you know, charges, etc. they pay for, you know, airports, etc. So it would be interesting to see that, because industry by industry, these can change, right? The overheads,
correct,
which is an income state, which is a performance. That's what correct. I was thinking, that, you know, what had contributed, or what had, you know, both negative and positive, I guess, the contribution, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're raising a very good point. I think you're touching on two issues. One is the demand side. Because, you know, with the shutdowns, the demand is stopped, isn't it? So you can't fly on an airline. So that's partly due to the shutdowns. But the other thing that you're mentioning is very important in terms of the overhead, for example, is the operations of the company. So even if there are shutdowns, what about the operations of the company? So which types of operations makes them more prone to bankruptcy, for example? We did observe that. I think the Debenhams case is important because this was the first one that went into administration at the very beginning of the crisis, because that says something about the magnitude of the importance of accounts payable for Debenhams.
For sure.
For sure. And that depends on the operations of Debenhams. So to me, I mean, I haven't studied Debenhams in particular, but to me, what it signals is the operations of the company are, they have, I don't know, 1,000, 10,000 different suppliers, and they buy the good, sell it, and pay back the payables. So
yeah, it's interesting, Gulnur, because it's a payback period is not quite clear in Debenhams. So that could be also, you know, probably it's, you know, over, I don't know, 100 days or so, which is also at some point it happens to Walmart and Tesco. Remember that 2-3 years ago, they were discussing about the payback period issues. But it's interesting, the cash flow is not so much dried in Debenhams financial accounts in the annual report. So it tells, you know, otherwise that, you know, unless they had, you know, how did they maintain the cash flows when they had, you know, such a bad trade payables or, you know, account payables accounts that were taking longer than usual payback period. That was, I was also looking at, but that detail was not quite, you know, I couldn't catch it. But that's really interesting, Gulnur, what you say, something also from...
Yeah, I mean, because they're under administration, they may not, I mean, for Debenhams, for example, they're under administration, so they may not be issuing the quarterly statement either.
Is there an idea that someone might buy the Debenhams? Is that I read yesterday somewhere that there might be somebody who's, you know,
but there could be, I mean, there could be various different ways of restructuring, and I think that will be, that needs to be investigated, how they restructure the company. And it could be a merger, it could be an acquisition, it could be further borrowing, we don't know. But I think, you know, they will all be investigated, I think, and I think they're all, I mean, very important questions.
But also in the airline industry, Gulnur, I heard also that some of the airlines got together for the revenue. So that's another thing, how they reacted to the kind of, you know, volatility as being more of a kind of ethical behavior within this kind of, you know, income generation, like when we know that there's this carbon emission and everything is going on, but maybe this is also a future that this had taught us something otherwise in financial data, which we can see probably, that, you know, airline industry doesn't have to run their own brand. They could be in alliance and as groups to run as well, right? That's also a response to the environment, probably, I was thinking as well. If this is something that, you know, might come in the financial statements, that, you know, for global warming, for example, you know, FTSE 100, this might be a case as well, to show that, you know, if the alliance group companies get together, and they could probably also respond to this, I was thinking.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in the differences within the companies in coping with the crisis, I think that's very important. And the airline industry in itself probably will be studied separately.
Mm-hmm.
But again, in terms of the airline industry, in terms of the employments, some airlines had layouts.
Mm-hmm.
Other airlines, they negotiated a cut to all personnel rather than layouts. So there were different ways of coping with the crisis in terms of employment as well.
Mm-hmm. That's again going back to the overheads, isn't it, Gulnur?
That's right. That's again
Yeah.
the overhead and the way they dealt with it. Some of them had the layouts, 1,500. I can't remember which airline was it, but more than 1,000 pilots.
Oh, British Airways, that was the case. BA.
Yeah, BA, yeah.
Yeah, BA.
Yeah. So more than 1,000 pilots were laid out, and that's very highly skilled personnel. But other airlines, I can't again remember which airline. It could be Ryanair, or I can't remember. But they negotiated a deal that everyone accepted a salary cut, and the workforce is ready now.
Yes, Ryanair, yes.
They're ready now. So they kept the whole workforce for the new opening of the operations. So there were different ways of dealing with it.
Right, yes.
We're going to see which one was more successful, and obviously which one is more ethical. And I think we will see them all, yeah. I mean, at this stage, all we can observe is in terms of the returns or in terms of the price reactions, all we can observe is through the daily price reactions to those. I mean, one could take one of those and have a look at the impact of, how to deal with reductions in the labor course, the labor work, and how does the market react to that? I mean, maybe the market reacts positively if the labor force is kept there altogether, with a certain cut to everyone, versus, laying out.
And do you observe the daily fluctuations, Gulnur, like using some online data? Do you use that, like a daily fluctuations? Do you observe?
Daily data, yeah, we use daily data. Yeah, the data that you have seen here, all the estimations are on daily data. Some of them for robustness, we're using different periods. That's because the daily data is available on that period. Yeah, it's all daily data. Yeah, and the results are very strong, Ishani, because it's very robust to whatever definition we use.
Yeah, it will be interesting if you present again, after, maybe coming back to this paper. It would be really interesting to hear your findings. Maybe 6 months even later, if you present.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we should do that. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Alicia, I know that time is over, but I think Shukriya had a question.
Yes, I believe it's been answered by the panelists already.
All right. Okay.
And I think Richard just had a comment, and he said, I have just Googled why stock markets are buoyant now, despite coronavirus. Quite a lot of research happening there.
Yeah.
Along with quite a few thank yous as well.
For good reason, yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
We've had a few thank yous as well, Gulnur, from, I believe, and people who may have left the chat already.
Shukriya didn't have a question. Her question is answered.
Yes, it's been answered.
She says thank you. Okay. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for valuable comments and valuable discussions. We did benefit a lot ourselves, and I'm glad that you've engaged. Thank you.